The ICU smells like antiseptic and recycled air, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache after 8 hours. Megan O'Brien moves between the 12 beds with a kind of quiet efficiency that makes her invisible to doctors and absolutely essential to patients. She's been doing this for 19 years, 3 tours in Helmand Province, then a career she can't quite talk about, then this Oak Creek Memorial in Houston, where nobody asks questions and the patients don't care what the paperwork says you used to be. Her hands move across the 4 lines like she's playing an instrument only she can hear. Cold stainless steel, warm skin, the soft click of the monitor as she adjusts the flow rate on the sodium chloride drip. Room 4, Room 5, Room 6. The patients relax when she enters. Something in her presence, not her voice, which is quiet, but something in the way she holds space, the way she knows what's needed before they have to ask. That's 19 years of knowing what dying looks like. That's Helmand Province bleeding into Houston like watercolors. She walks with a barely perceptible limp in her left leg, the kind of thing nobody notices unless they're looking for it. Her eyes track the exits the way normal people track clocks. During shift change briefing, she stands in the back of the nurse's station while the day shift hands off to the evening crew, her head down, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her name in small white letters, M. O'Brien, RN. No one is looking at her closely enough to see the faded scar tissue on her knuckles, thick and white as old rope, the kind of scarring that comes from things that don't get discussed in hospital orientation. She scrubs in for a central line placement on room 9, and her hands don't tremble. They never do. In her locker, behind the protein bars and the half-empty bottle of electrolyte tablets, she keeps a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is creased and darkened by things the cleaning supplies in the break room will never touch. The name stenciled inside is O'Brien in block letters, faded now, the way everything from another life gets faded. She doesn't look at them anymore. Doesn't need to. The muscle memory lives in her hands, in the way she moves, in the choices she makes when the room gets quiet and something needs to be fixed. Room 7 is different. The comatose colonel occupies the bed like a ship run aground, ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the steady in-out that means alive but not living. His chart reads like a death sentence written by people who've already given up, 64 years old, multiple trauma, poor neurological prognosis, no family consent for aggressive intervention. The residents have stopped checking on him. The attending physician visits once a day out of obligation. He's a placeholder, a bed that will eventually be empty for someone who has a shot. Megan checks his vitals at 6:56 in the morning, before the shift change briefing starts, when the unit is still quiet. His blood pressure is 118/72. His heart rate is a steady 72 beats per minute. The ventilator is delivering oxygen at 40%. Everything about him is stable. Everything about him says nothing will change. She adjusts the head of the bed down 2 degrees, checks the Foley catheter, records the numbers in his chart with the precision of someone who's filled out medical paperwork in field conditions with blood on her gloves. Her jaw tightens for just a second. The briefest flicker of something that looks like recognition, or anger, or both at once. Then her face goes carefully blank. The professional mask slides back into place like a door closing. She moves to room 8 and continues her rounds. Dr. Sterling arrives at 7:15 in Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Megan's monthly car payment. He's 47 and moves through the hospital like a man who's never been told no in any meaningful way. His suit is charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe. His watch is silver and expensive. His voice carries across the ICU as he trails 3 residents through the unit like he's conducting a tour of his personal kingdom. He's talking before he's even entered room 8. The board's pushing this veteran charity hire initiative, he says to the residents, loud enough that everyone in the unit hears it. They think it's good optics. Hiring former military staff to work alongside actual professionals. He laughs. The residents laugh. The sound of it moves through the nurse's station like smoke. Megan continues charting. Her pen doesn't stop moving. The numbers flow onto the page in neat, precise lines. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Medication administration. The documentation that nobody reads unless something goes wrong. Sterling stops at the nurse's station. He looks down at Megan with the expression of a man examining something left on the sidewalk. His eyes move from her face to her hands, scarred, steady, moving across the chart, and then to her scrubs, which are faded from 100 washings. "You're the new one, right?" His voice is casual, the way you'd talk to someone taking your order. "From some community clinic." She meets his eyes with one measured breath. The kind of breath you take before you say something you'll regret, except she won't regret it because she's already decided not to feel anything about this moment. Her voice comes out steady, low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing you can imagine. "I go where I'm needed, doctor." Sterling's expression shifts. It's like watching someone try to grab water. He expected something different, maybe apologetic, maybe nervous, maybe something that would give him traction. Instead, he got a statement that closes the conversation like a door. He looks at the residents, who are suddenly interested in their phones. He looks back at Megan. She's already moved on to the next chart. The morning briefing happens at 7:30. Megan stands in the back while the night shift nurse, Derek, who's been doing this for 4 years, hands off his patients. His voice moves through the list like a recitation: stable, stable, declining, stable, stable, pending. When he gets to room 7, he says, "Colonel status unchanged. Neuro exam remains depressed. Family still hasn't authorized any aggressive measures. I'd expect we're looking at comfort care transition within the week." Derek doesn't look at Megan when he says it. Nobody looks at Megan during briefing. It's like she's furniture that happens to have a pulse. At 8:30, Megan's phone buzzes in her locker. She's between patients, and she pulls it out in the break room where she usually sits alone. The text is from Marcus, her son. 24 years old, still figuring out which direction his life goes. "Mom, I need to talk. When's your next day off?" She texts back without hesitation, "Thursday. Come by after work." Marcus doesn't know what happens in the ICU. He knows she's a nurse. He knows she works at Oak Creek Memorial. He doesn't know about the colonel in room 7. He doesn't know about Dr. Sterling. He doesn't know that his mother moves through the hospital like she's carrying classified documents in her body, because that's exactly what she's doing. He just knows that his own job is hard. He works in logistics at the Port of Houston, 40 hours a week of paper trails and shipping manifests, and that sometimes he needs to hear his mother's voice in real time, not text form. He needs to sit at her kitchen table and have her do what she's always done, listen like she's got all the time in the world, even when she's working a 16-hour shift. Megan finishes her break and moves back into the unit. The fluorescent lights buzz their mechanical song. The monitors beep their steady rhythm. The ventilators wheeze in room 7, keeping a man alive who might not want to be alive anymore. Sterling is doing rounds in Bay 12 when she passes. He's lecturing the residents about ventilator management, dropping medical terms with the confidence of someone who learned them from PowerPoints instead of from sitting in the sand with a trauma kit and a prayer. She doesn't look at him. Doesn't acknowledge his existence. Just moves through the unit with the same quiet efficiency she showed up with at 6 o'clock this morning. What Sterling doesn't see, what he never sees, because he only looks at surfaces, is the way Megan's hands still don't shake when she places a central line. He doesn't see the scar tissue on her knuckle spelling out a story he'll never read. He doesn't see the pair of worn combat boots hidden in her locker behind the protein bars. He doesn't see the name stenciled inside in faded block letters. He doesn't see that the woman he just dismissed as a charity hire has already saved 42 lives this year, most of them through interventions that weren't in any textbook because they came from learning how to keep people breathing in places where the helicopters don't land. He just sees a middle-aged nurse with graying hair who keeps her head down during shift change briefings. And that's where his understanding stops, permanent and incomplete, like a sentence cut off before the meaning becomes clear. By 10:02 a.m., word has already spread through the physician lounge. Sterling told 3 people who each told 2 people. The board's hiring veterans again. Token hires. People from trauma centers and field medicine clinics who think they know better than the real hospitals. Megan doesn't hear these conversations. She's in room 7, checking the ventilator settings, adjusting before runs, making sure a man who no one thinks will wake up is at least comfortable while he's asleep. She reads his chart again. Colonel Marcus Reynolds. 64. Retired Special Operations Command. Decorated. The room goes so quiet you can hear the fluorescent lights hum. She knows this name. She knows this rank. She knows exactly what decisions led to him being here, and her son being broken in ways that still don't have names, and her sitting in a hospital in Houston pretending she's just a nurse. But that's the job. That's always been the job. Keep moving. Keep quiet. Keep the masks in place. The combat boots stay in the locker. The name stays faded. The pass stays classified. Her phone buzzes again. Marcus, Thursday at 6. She types back, "I'll make dinner." And she turns back to the ventilator, and the machines, and the quiet work of keeping people alive when the world has already decided they're gone. The shift change at Oak Creek Memorial started like every other Tuesday morning, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, the nurses' station filling with bodies and voices and the smell of reheated coffee. Megan stood at the medication cabinet entering orders into the system, her fingers steady on the keyboard, when she heard Dr. Sterling's voice cut across the counter like a blade. "I'm calling it now," he announced to the room, 8 nurses, for residents, all of them stopping to listen. He leaned against the counter with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Our veteran hire won't last the week. These people think the hospital is boot camp, but they fold when they realize we have standards." The silence that followed was the kind that made you hear the ventilators humming in the ICU down the hall. Sterling pulled his wallet out with a theatrical flourish. $50 says she quits by Friday. He positioned a crisp $50 bill on the counter like he was placing a bet on a horse he'd already seen lose. 2 residents laughed, nervous, empty sounds that bounced off the tile and died. The other nurses exchanged glances, the kind that said they'd heard worse but not from someone wearing a title that made him untouchable. Megan continued entering medication orders. Her fingers didn't falter. Her jaw didn't clench. A single tear escaped down her left cheek and she wiped it away without breaking rhythm, without looking up, without giving Sterling the satisfaction of seeing anything except the back of a head and shoulders that refused to bend. She'd faced worse than this. She'd faced insurgents at checkpoints, faced decisions that cost lives, faced watching her son grow up with a ghost in the house where his father used to be. A surgeon's contempt was just noise, the kind you learned to filter out the way you filtered out mortar fire in the distance. Sterling waited for a reaction. Got none. Moved on, calling her G.I. Jane as he walked away, his voice designed to carry, designed to humiliate, designed to make her flinch in front of witnesses. She didn't flinch. The next day in the cafeteria, Megan sat alone at a corner table with a tray of soup and crackers. This was her first break in 9 hours. Her feet ached. Her lower back was sending signals of distress that reminded her she wasn't 25 anymore. The soup was lukewarm, the kind of institutional comfort food that was more about calories than taste, and for exactly 6 minutes, she allowed herself to exist in the world of people who got to rest. Sterling appeared like a shadow in her peripheral vision. He stopped at her table with the kind of deliberate casualness that made her stomach tighten. For a moment, just a moment, she thought he was going to sit down. Instead, he stumbled, his hand catching the edge of her tray with all the delicate grace of an avalanche. Soup exploded across her scrubs and the floor in a hot arc. The plastic bowl skittered across the tile and came to rest upside down under a table. Crackers scattered like debris. For 5 full seconds, nobody in the cafeteria moved. The fluorescent lights hummed. A distant monitor beeped from somewhere in the building. "Oh, so sorry," Sterling said, dusting his hands like he'd just accomplished something. "Guess you're used to eating MRE standing up anyway." He smiled. Not a smile. A baring of teeth. A performance for the 3 orderlies and 2 other nurses pretending very hard not to watch. Megan knelt to clean it. Her hands moved methodically, gathering paper towels, wiping the tile, salvaging what could be salvaged. She was already calculating, new scrubs were in her locker, she had 43 minutes left on her break, the soup would probably come out if she used cold water first. Details. Small things. The things you controlled when everything else was being weaponized against you. Sterling dropped a patient chart at her feet. It landed with a sharp slap of paper against tile. Pick that up, sweetheart. Room 7 needs new orders. The word hung there, sweetheart, like a boot on a spider. Diminishing. Possessing. The kind of word men used when they wanted you to feel small in front of witnesses. Megan rose with one measured breath. A single tear escaped as she met his eyes, not from pain, not from shame, but from the sheer effort of not saying what a decade of military training had taught her to say to men who confused rank with character. She was wearing a pair of scrubs and a hospital ID. He was wearing a title. That was the only difference between them, and they both knew it. I've cleaned up worse messes from better men, she said, her voice steady, the kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. She picked up the chart with hands that didn't shake, held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and handed it back to him. He snatched it and stormed off, his face the color of arterial blood, and the cafeteria exhaled. That afternoon, Sterling pulled her into his office and lectured her for 20 minutes about attitude problems and insubordination. The office smelled like leather and expensive cologne and the particular staleness of a space where someone spent more time on appearance than on actually helping people. He sat behind his desk, always behind the desk, always elevated, and conducted a masterclass in how to weaponize bureaucracy. You should be grateful we gave someone like you a chance, he concluded, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd never been taught that gratitude flowed in both directions. Megan stood at attention. Not intentionally. It was muscle memory from a life she'd left behind, a posture that was hardwired so deep in her nervous system that stress brought it roaring back. Permission to return to my patients, doctor, she replied with perfect calm. His face reddened, but he dismissed her with a wave, the gesture of a man losing control and trying very hard to hide it. She returned to the ICU at 2:33 p.m., and the work resumed, the endless arithmetic of medicine, the equations of oxygen and pressure and the sheer will to keep someone alive when their body was ready to quit. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she saw 2 hours later when she was changing 4 bags in room 4. The monitor in room 7 caught her attention, not because anything was wrong, but because something had shifted. The patient log showed a visitor entry, J. Brennan, nephew, signed in 40 minutes ago. She froze. Colonel Richard Brennan had no living family. She'd verified this during intake. She'd memorized it. She'd memorized a lot of things about the man sleeping through a medically induced coma in that room, things that had cost her sleep in the past 3 months. She walked to room 7 and found it exactly as it should have been, the ventilator still working its mechanical rhythm, the 4 lines still dripping their precise doses of medication, except the window latch was unlocked from the inside, and there were muddy boot prints on the tile that hadn't been there that morning. Her heart rate spiked. Her breathing steadied. Old habits reasserting themselves. She paged security with a quiet code, the kind that didn't trigger a hospital-wide response, just a gentle inquiry from the security desk. Then she walked back to the nurse's station and pulled the colonel's full medical file from the system. She read it standing up, her hand steady, her face giving away nothing. Richard Brennan. Colonel. Special Operations Command. The man who commanded the operation in Helmand Province 18 months ago. The man whose orders sent her son Marcus into a firefight that still visited him in the dark, visiting him in screams and sweat and the kind of nightmares that medication couldn't touch. The same officer whose after-action report she'd read 100 times in the dark, the same report that listed casualties in clinical language, that documented decisions the way accountants documented losses. The man her husband had died protecting. Sterling appeared behind her like a bad diagnosis, and she closed the file. Problem, G.I. Jane. His tone was conversational, which somehow made it worse. Room 7 had an unauthorized visitor, she said, her voice level. Visitor log says he signed in but never signed out. Sterling rolled his eyes with the particular exhaustion of someone tired of being questioned by people he considered beneath questioning. Probably a volunteer who forgot to sign out. Stop being paranoid. He walked away before she could respond, dismissing both her concern and her lived experience in a single gesture. She wanted to argue. She wanted to pull the security footage and show him the boot prints and explain that visitors don't appear in coma patients' rooms without a reason, that visitors don't leave windows unlocked unless they're planning to return. But she knew how that would end. She'd seen it before, concern reframed as anxiety, caution reframed as paranoia, experience reframed as the hysterical overreaction of someone who'd been deployed too long. That evening, her son Marcus picked her up after her shift. He was 23 now, studying engineering on the GI Bill, the kind of focused determination that came from knowing exactly what you'd lost and swearing you'd build something better. He picked her up in his used Civic and asked about her day, and she told him it was fine, just the usual hospital politics, nothing worth discussing. He mentioned the nightmares were back. Same ones, she asked quietly, her eyes on the traffic ahead. He nodded. He didn't need to elaborate. She knew the nightmares. She had them too. The difference was that she'd learned to compartmentalize them, to file them away in the locked room in her mind where all the operational details lived, the things you carried but never spoke about. She didn't tell him that his commanding officer was 30 feet away on the 3rd floor, medically paralyzed, breathing through a tube. Didn't tell him that someone had been in that room who shouldn't have been, or that boot prints and unlocked windows suggested intent. Didn't tell him any of the things that kept her awake at night because he was 23 and he deserved better than her wars. When she got home, she opened her locker and looked at the photo she kept hidden beneath the protein bars and the extra pair of scrubs. Marcus's unit in Helmand Province, 73 soldiers arranged in formation, her husband in a back row, the colonel front and center, the man whose decisions had rippled forward in time and cost lives. She closed the locker before the tears came. The visitor log entry stopped her cold. Room 7, 6:06 a.m. Jade Brennan, nephew. She stood at the nurse's station holding the clipboard, staring at those 3 letters like they might rearrange themselves into something different, something that wouldn't shatter the careful separation between her 2 lives. 12 years ago, Helmand Province. Captain James Brennan had ordered her son's unit into a valley where the Taliban were waiting. 3 Marines didn't come home. Marcus came home broken. And now his commanding officer was lying comatose on the 7th floor, and someone who shared his blood had just walked through these doors. Megan set the clipboard down slowly. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. But something in her chest tightened like a fist closing around her heart. She had 20 minutes before her shift officially started. She used them to compose herself in the supply closet, pressing her forehead against the cool metal shelving, breathing in the antiseptic smell that had become her anchor to normalcy. The tactical breathing came naturally, for counts in, hold for 4, out for 4. The same rhythm that had kept her alive in Kandahar kept her upright now in Houston. When she emerged, her jaw was set and her expression neutral. Just another nurse. Just another morning. The summons came at 6:58 a.m. Sterling's office. Now. She knew before she walked in that this was different. The way his secretary avoided eye contact. The silence in the hallway. The door closing behind her with a soft, definitive click. Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk with a folder spread open in front of him like a prosecutor laying out evidence. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't greet her. He just slid the folder across the polished surface toward her with 2 fingers, the way someone might push a piece of contaminated evidence across a table. Megan didn't move. She let him wait. "Open it," he said finally, his voice carrying the edge of a man unused to being kept waiting. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light, platinum, expensive, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent. Everything about Sterling screamed old money and institutional protection. Board connections. Family leverage. The kind of power that didn't need to justify itself. She opened the folder. The first page was a fabricated incident report dated 3 days earlier. Failure to follow chain of command. Nurse O'Brien questioned physician order regarding patient sedation protocols. Insubordination noted. The signature at the bottom wasn't Sterling's. It was Dr. Morrison's. She recognized the looping, pretentious handwriting. But Morrison had been on vacation. Morrison hadn't been in the building. The lie was so blatant it was almost artful, constructed with the confidence of someone who'd never met real consequences. She turned the page. Inappropriate familiarity with patients. Boundary violations. Patient and family expressing concern regarding nurse's behavior. Risk mitigation recommended. This one was dated yesterday. She'd spent yesterday working alongside Sterling in the ICU. She knew every patient she'd touched, every conversation she'd had. Every single word was fabrication. Page 3, failure to document medication administration. Controlled substance discrepancy. Investigation pending. Her signature was forged. The handwriting was close but not hers, too careful, too deliberate. Someone had spent time on this. Her chest didn't heave. Her face didn't flush. She simply read each page with the same methodical attention she'd use scanning a patient's chart, filing away dates, signatures, the specific language of institutional betrayal. This was strategic. Sophisticated. Sterling wasn't just trying to humiliate her anymore. He was building a paper case, the kind that would stick in her file, the kind that would follow her if she tried to transfer, the kind that would make the credentialing board hesitate. Consider this a formal warning, Sterling said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just cornered prey. One more issue, one more complaint from a physician, one more patient concern, and we have no choice but to recommend termination for cause. You understand the implications? No severance. No reference. A termination for safety concerns follows you. Some hospitals won't even interview you after this. Megan closed the folder carefully. She didn't hand it back. She set it on the edge of his desk with the same deliberate precision he'd used to slide it toward her. When she looked up, her eyes were the color of water that was very deep and very cold. "Understood, doctor," she said quietly. 10 words. No argument. No defense. The kind of response that would look, on a recording, like complete acquiescence. It was the voice she used when she was ordering people to move and they needed to obey without hesitation. Sterling didn't recognize it. He heard only compliance. She walked out without waiting to be dismissed. The morning rounds happened an hour later. She was supposed to take reports on 3 ICU patients, then transition to post-op care. Sterling made the announcement in front of the entire nursing staff, his voice carrying across the unit like he was reading a schedule change, not dismantling someone's position. Effective immediately, Megan is being reassigned to medical surgical floors. We need someone with more intensive care experience stepping up in critical care. I'm sure she'll be valuable in a different capacity. The other nurses didn't look at her. They looked away with the careful practice of people who'd learned not to make eye contact with the wounded. One of them, Jennifer, who'd trained alongside her for 3 months, suddenly became very interested in her computer screen. The dismissal was complete. Institutional. Final. Megan gathered her things from her locker. Her hand brushed past the combat boots without hesitation. They weren't why she was here anymore. She'd built a new identity, a new life, a new version of herself that fit into scrubs and hospital protocols. Sterling had just proven that identity was tissue-thin, that everything could be unmade with forged signatures and strategic whispers. But that wasn't the worst part. Before she left the ICU, muscle memory pulled her toward room 7. One final check on the colonel. His vitals were stable, blood pressure holding at 128/76, oxygen saturation at 94% on low-flow nasal cannula, heart rate steady at 62. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound as familiar as her own breathing after 12 years of field medicine. She should have walked away. Protocol required her to leave the room, to transition her patients to the day-shift nurses, to let go of the complicated weight of James Brennan. Instead, she noticed the backpack. It was military issue, olive drab, wedged behind the ventilator stand and covered by a blanket that didn't belong in this room. Megan's hands moved on their own, not conscious decision, but muscle memory from a different life. She opened the zipper slowly, carefully, the way she'd opened hundreds of bags in dusty compounds where explosives were as common as sand. Inside, no bomb. No threat. Just a framed photograph of Colonel Brennan in dress uniform, arm around a young Marine in desert camouflage, both of them grinning with the invincibility of men who hadn't yet learned what they could survive. A discharge paper, the edges worn soft from handling, marked in the boxes labeled PTSD, service-connected, and medical retirement. And a letter, handwritten, the ink smudged in places like it had been wet from tears or rain or both. The first line made her stomach drop, "You left us there to die." Footsteps in the hallway. Megan zipped the bag with practiced silence and slid it back behind the ventilator, using the blanket to conceal it the way she'd found it. She stepped away from the bed just as the doorway filled with a man who looked like violence given physical form. 6'4", maybe 250, shoulders that strained the fabric of a button-down shirt. A buzz cut that suggested military background, though not active duty. The hair was too long, the discipline visible only in posture, not grooming. His eyes were the grey of concrete, utterly empty of effect, the kind of stare she recognized from 17 years of Special Forces operations. Dead eyes. The eyes of someone who'd seen too much and felt too little. His right hand rested on his jacket, thumb hooked on the fabric in a way that suggested he was holding something underneath. Something that didn't belong in a hospital. "Where is he?" His voice shook like old wood under stress. "Where is Colonel Brennan?" Megan stepped between him and the bed. Not confrontation. Positioning. The same way she'd positioned herself between frightened patients and panicking families, the body language of someone trained to de-escalate without backing down. Her voice dropped to the low register she used with confused patients coming out of anesthesia, the cadence she'd learned from talk-down specialists in Kandahar. "Sir, visiting hours don't start until..." He pulled the gun from his jacket. The weapon was a Glock 19, service model, the kind of gun that meant training. The kind of gun that meant intent. His hand shook like someone's and nobody else's, like someone holding back enormous force, and Megan recognized that shaking too. She'd seen it in the hands of men coming apart, men whose nervous systems couldn't process anymore, men who'd been broken down to individual trauma responses. "Where is Colonel Brennan?" His voice fractured like ice under stress. "Where?" Megan didn't move. Didn't step back. Didn't raise her hands. Every nurse in the hospital was trained for active shooter scenarios, for running, for hiding, for calling security. She did none of those things. She stood still, her presence like a weight in the room, her voice sinking another octave. "I see you," she said quietly. 5 words. But the meaning underneath was everything. "I see you. I see what you are. I see what broke you. I see the man you were before this moment, and I see the man you're about to become if you pull that trigger, and I'm telling you that I see both versions and neither one of them is the person you have to be." The gun wavered. His eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. And Megan O'Brien, former senior chief petty officer, decorated Special Forces operative, classified operations veteran, mother of a traumatized son, victim of institutional betrayal, realized in that instant that everything she'd hidden, everything she'd carefully separated, everything she'd built as a civilian life was about to collapse. Because the moment she saved this man, and she would save him, because that's what she did, what she'd always done, everything would change. The hospital would know. Sterling would know. The man upstairs in room 7, the commanding officer who'd sent her son into a valley of death, would learn that the nurse who'd been quietly cleaning bedpans had just performed a miracle. And there would be no more hiding. The ICU erupts. Nurses scream and sprint for exits, their badges clattering against sternum shields like startled birds taking flight. A resident drops a chart, papers scattering across tile, and dives behind the nurse's station. A respiratory therapist grabs her tablet and runs toward the stairwell. Dr. Sterling backs into his office with the slow, measured steps of a man watching his world collapse, and locks the door. Everyone runs. Everyone except Megan O'Brien. She stands at the threshold of room 7, watching a massive armed man, 6'3", maybe 280, shoulders carved like a linebacker, screaming for Colonel Brennan with a loaded weapon in his shaking hands. His voice breaks between words. His breathing comes in ragged, hyperventilated bursts. The gun wavers, not from hesitation but from something worse, uncontrolled tremor. A man at the edge of his own mind. Megan walks directly toward him. Not running. Not backing away. Walking with her hands visible, palms out, shoulders squared but unthreatening, the posture of someone who has talked down insurgents at checkpoints in Helmand Province at 2 in the morning, weapon to weapon, soul to soul. Each step is measured. Her breathing is controlled. Her voice, when she speaks, drops into a register most people have never heard, low, steady, carrying the weight of absolute authority masked as compassion. "I know you're hurting," she says. Each word is separated. Deliberate. "I know you served with him. I know he was your commanding officer." The man's eyes snap toward her. For a moment, the gun steadies slightly. His jaw trembles. Sweat pours down his face in rivulets, darkening his shirt collar. His breathing accelerates further. Not calming. Worsening. Megan reads the signs with the precision of someone who has seen 1,000 men break, the dilated pupils, the flush spreading across his neck, the way his free hand clutches his chest. Acute PTSD. But also something else. Something physiological. His heart is failing. "Sir, I need you to look at me," Megan says, her voice never changing cadence. "You're having a cardiac event right now." The man's eyes go unfocused. "He left my unit," he whispers. His voice cracks. "Left us there. In that valley. Said he'd send extraction. Never came." His gun hand drops slightly. "I came to tell him." "I don't know what I came to tell him." His knees buckle. Megan moves, not toward the weapon, but toward him, her hand still open. She catches him as he collapses, dead weight against her frame, and lowers him to the floor with controlled descent. His breathing is now shallow, rapid. Gasping. She rips open his shirt, his jugular veins distend like cables, his heart sounds muffled beneath fluid, his skin cool and clammy. Blood pressure crashing. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium filling with blood, compressing his heart, suffocating it from the inside. She has maybe 3 minutes before he goes into full arrest. The gun lies on the floor 6 feet away. Megan doesn't look at it. She grabs a chest tube kit from the crash cart, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over, the part of her brain that has performed field medicine under fire in dust storms and darkness. She preps his chest with betadine in one swipe, the smell of iodine sharp and immediate, and positions her needle between the 5th and 6th ribs, angled toward the heart. The needle goes in. Smooth. Practiced. No hesitation. 50 milliliters of blood draws back into the syringe. Bright red. Fresh. His heart rate drops from 140 to 110. His oxygen saturation climbs from 68 to 82. She starts a second for line, draws labs, calls for a gurney. Her voice is steady. Professional. The scared nurses who peeked from behind stations hear her calling orders like she's read them from a textbook 1,000 times. "I need 2 units O negative, stat. Get cardiothoracic on the phone. And someone grab his chart, I need his baseline vitals, any history of hypertension, any cardiac issues before this happened." Paramedics arrive within minutes. They load him onto the gurney, and she gives them a handoff that would make any military trauma surgeon proud, a 34-year-old male, acute PTSD presentation with concurrent cardiac tamponade secondary to hemopericardium, etiology unknown, emergency pericardiocentesis performed on scene, removed 50 ccs of blood, vital stabilizing, 2 falls established, 2 units whole blood en route. Patients needing cardiothoracic and psych evaluation, probably also needs to talk to whoever that commanding officer is when he wakes up. The gurney rolls out. The room goes quiet. The only sound is the ventilator in room 7 still wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the drama around it. Dr. Sterling emerges from his office as the paramedics push through the ICU doors. His face is white. His hands shake as he walks toward the nurse's station, and for a moment, his eyes meet Megan's across the room. She sees something flicker there, not gratitude, not respect, but something far worse, fear. The realization that he had no idea who he was standing next to. Within an hour, he's on the phone with board members in the administrative wing, his voice carrying through the closed door loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. Megan can hear him from the break room, where she sits alone with a cup of coffee that's gone cold. His words come fast, desperate, layered with panic. Reckless. That's what it was. Cowboy medicine. She violated 17 protocols. His voice rises. She performed a surgical procedure without authorization, without consulting cardiothoracic, without even checking if the patient had capacity to consent. Pause. Yes, he's stable, but that's not the point. She endangered the entire ICU. What if he'd had a weapon malfunction? What if she'd nicked his heart? Where were her credentials for that kind of intervention? By evening, 2 security guards arrive at Megan's locker. They don't look angry. They look embarrassed. One of them, a man named Harrison who's worked at Oak Creek for 8 years, won't meet her eyes as he hands her the suspension notice. Pending investigation, he says quietly. You're on paid administrative leave. Hospital policy. Megan nods once. She empties her locker methodically, placing her personal items into a cardboard box, a photo of Marcus in his dress uniform, a half-empty bottle of hand lotion, a worn coffee mug that says, "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. At the bottom, she retrieves the pair of combat boots she's kept hidden since the day she arrived. She holds them for a moment, feeling the weight of 17 years condensed into scuffed leather and faded laces. The security guard watching her sees the boots and something crosses his face, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of a question he'll never ask. Megan places them gently on top of everything else, folds the cardboard flaps, and carries the box out of Oak Creek Memorial without looking back. What she doesn't know is that Sterling has already contacted an ex-colleague at the credentialing board, the kind of call that moves through institutional networks like a virus. He's also hired a private investigator, a man named Dalton Price who specializes in background checks for medical boards, and given him explicit instructions, find the gaps in Megan O'Brien's employment history. 7 years unaccounted for. No continuous employment record. No social media. No credit history before 2010. It's the kind of absence that makes bureaucrats nervous. It's the kind of absence that gets people flagged. She doesn't know that Sterling is already crafting a narrative, an unstable former employee who snapped under pressure, who performed unauthorized procedures, who poses a liability to future employers. One phone call and she'll be blacklisted from every hospital system in Texas. One email and her nursing license will be permanently revoked. But none of that matters yet. What matters is that Marcus finds her at the kitchen table at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, still in her scrubs because she couldn't bring herself to change, staring at a photograph of his unit in Helmand Province taken in 2012. Her hands grip the edge of the table. Her eyes are dry, but there's a brittleness to her posture that Marcus recognizes from childhood, the way his mother looks when she's holding herself together by counting breaths. Mom. His voice cracks. Why are you home? It's the middle of your shift. She doesn't answer. She can't. How do you explain to your son that you saved the life of the commanding officer who sent his father into a valley where the extraction never came? How do you explain that the act of saving someone just cost you everything you've built in 17 years of burying your past? The rain starts outside, hammering the kitchen window like a judgment she can't escape. And Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer, decorated war hero, the woman who has held more lives in her hands than most surgeons, the woman who walked toward a loaded weapon while everyone else ran, finally lets herself cry. She has no idea that the truth is about to arrive by helicopter. By that evening, Sterling had made 17 phone calls. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to collecting favors, board members who owed him dinner dates, credentialing committee chairs who'd accepted his recommendations for years, hospital administrators who understood the unspoken language of professional protection. He sat in his office with the door locked, the kind of silence that comes before a fall, and he painted Megan's heroism as recklessness. Reckless cowboy medicine. Protocol violations. A trauma procedure performed without attending physician authorization, without proper drainage tubes, without the 17 checkpoints that separated competence from catastrophe in his carefully constructed narrative. He didn't mention that the armed man had survived. He didn't mention that vital signs stabilized. He mentioned only the deviation from process, the audacity of a nurse acting outside her scope, the liability that could bankrupt the institution. By 9 p.m., the calls had shifted tone. By 10 p.m., they'd stopped returning his messages. The security escort arrived at 6:24 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, and there was no mercy in it. 2 officers in grey uniforms, one holding a manila envelope, one with an expression like someone delivering a death notice. Megan stood in the break room still wearing yesterday's scrubs. She'd never gone home, had stayed through the night shift working room 7, checking the armed man's chest tube, monitoring his O2 saturation, watching the numbers climb from 67 to 74 to 81 as his collapsed lung re-inflated with each mechanical breath. Sinus rhythm had returned at 3 a.m. She'd texted her son. Dad would have done the same. He'd never responded. The security officers didn't explain the suspension notice with any particular cruelty. They simply handed her the paperwork and asked her to collect her personal items. The oxygen monitor on the wall beeped its steady rhythm as she walked to her locker. Her hands pulled out the pair of worn combat boots, the leather creased with memory, the laces still knotted from Kandahar dust, and she held them against her chest as they walked her through the main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial in the gray light of early morning. Rain had started overnight, and it felt like judgment. 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days later, and Marcus sat at the kitchen table across from his mother. She hadn't moved since he'd found her there at 2:19 p.m., hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't turned from the photograph spread in front of her. The photo was faded now, color bleeding away like old memory. His unit. Helmand Province, 2011. 19 men in desert camouflage, standing in front of a compound with windows like dead eyes, and his mother's finger rested on one face, Captain Marcus O'Brien Sr., her husband, his father, the man who came home wrong. He died not in combat but 3 years later, PTSD like a disease that ate him from inside out, and his mother had never spoken about what happened in that province, what orders were given, what decisions brought her husband home broken. Megan's tears fell onto the photograph without sound. Marcus set his backpack down slowly. Mom. Her eyes were the color of storms. She didn't wipe the tears away. She didn't explain why she was home early or why her hospital badge was gone or why the combat boots were sitting on the kitchen counter like evidence of a life she'd buried. Some things we carry alone so others don't have to, she said, her voice like wind through a canyon, and Marcus understood in that moment that his mother had carried more than he'd ever known. And then the world arrived by helicopter. 3 days later, exactly 72 hours after Megan O'Brien was escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial, the Black Hawk touched down on the hospital's helipad with a violence that shook windows across 3 floors. The rotor wash was a physical thing, pushing against glass and steel, and 2 figures descended with the kind of controlled precision that marked them as warriors. Navy SEALs in dress blues. The uniforms were dress whites, actually, the kind worn for ceremonies and formal recognition, and they moved through the hospital corridors like a tide. Security tried to stop them. Neither SEAL slowed. The one in front, tall enough that doorframe seemed narrow around him, shoulders that moved like continental plates shifting, looked directly at the security guard and said, "Where is Valkyrie?" The name hit the hospital like a defibrillator. Valkyrie. Not a staff member. Not a nurse named Megan O'Brien. A call sign. A legend. The blood drained from Dr. Sterling's face as he watched from the administrator's office, watched through the glass partition as two members of Naval Special Warfare Group 2 walked past every nurse and every doctor who'd heard him mock a veteran charity hire, who'd watched him drop her lunch tray, who'd seen him humiliate her with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never understood that quiet people often carry the heaviest weight. Marcus stepped forward first. His voice cracked like ice breaking. "Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien." And then the elevator doors opened and Megan walked out in civilian clothes, jeans and a grey sweatshirt, her hair down for the first time anyone at Oak Creek had seen it, and she looked at her son with an expression that contained 17 years of silence. A trembling nurse, the one who'd witnessed the cafeteria humiliation, who'd seen Sterling drop the chart at Megan's feet, read from a Pentagon file delivered by courier not to the hospital administrator but directly to Dr. Sterling's office. The file was sealed. It was also open. 3 tours. Naval Special Warfare Group. Embedded Special Forces Operations. Operation Red Dagger, Helmand Province, 2010 to 2011. The nurse's hand shook as she read. The SEAL commander's voice cut through the silence like a blade through water. Navy Cross. He let that hang. 2 silver stars. Another pause. The weight of each medal settling on the room like snow. Purple Heart. His eyes moved to Dr. Sterling through the glass. She pulled 11 men out of an ambush we weren't supposed to survive, and the government buried it all when the operation went black. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. And then the FBI agents arrived. They walked in with the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from absolute certainty. 3 of them, badges out, and the first one moved directly to Dr. Sterling's office. The evidence was already documented. Forged performance reviews dated back 3 years. Falsified credential verification forms from the Navy Medical Credentialing Board. Sterling had made direct contact, had stated in writing that Megan's employment history contained gaps consistent with classified work, implying possible stolen valor. He'd hired a private investigator named Marcus Holloway for $47,000, and when Holloway had discovered that the gaps were classified appropriately, that they matched perfectly with documented naval service, Sterling had attempted to offer him an additional $15,000 to change his report. It was all documented. Text messages. Bank transfers. Voice memos where Sterling could be heard saying, "That's what we're paying you for, Marcus. Make it work." The FBI agent read Sterling his rights in a voice that contained no judgment because judgment required some recognition of humanity. Sterling's hands shook as they cuffed him. His colleagues watched from their desks. His friends pretended suddenly to be very busy with paperwork. And as they walked him past the ICU, past the nurse's station where he'd made his public bet, past every person who'd witnessed him mock a woman he'd never understood, the silence was louder than any alarm could ever be. 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Robert Sterling selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in the suburbs of Houston. His suit was wrinkled. His nameplate read Bob S. His medical license was revoked. His marriage had dissolved in court papers that included the phrase fundamental breach of character. His country club membership was revoked. The hospital's board chair who'd protected him resigned in disgrace and faced his own ethics investigation. For other staff members came forward with documentation of Sterling's pattern, for other people pushed out over 3 years, all minorities, all veterans, all with fabricated performance reviews. The story ran on local news for 2 weeks. National news picked it up for 1. Decorated Navy SEAL worked as ICU nurse, hospital director arrested for covering up her heroism ran the headline, and then it disappeared because the news cycle moves like a current and there are always new stories drowning. But inside Oak Creek Memorial, something had changed. The ICU was renamed the O'Brien Trauma Wing. Funded by the Navy Special Warfare Foundation, decorated with photographs of service members who became healthcare workers, and in a glass case near the entrance, a pair of worn combat boots sat beneath a plaque of brushed steel. The plaque read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Navy, Navy Cross, Silver Star, 2, Operation Red Dagger, Helmand Province, Valkyrie. The truth was finally visible. Megan returned to the ICU for months after her reinstatement, her back pay deposited in an account that would fund her son's final year of college. She worked the same shifts. She said very little. When a cocky resident dismissed a veteran patient's PTSD symptoms as overblown, she took him to the medication room, no drama, no audience, and said with the kind of quiet that cuts deeper than any volume, "That patient survived things you can't imagine. Show respect or find another unit." The resident apologized immediately. Colonel Brennan's eyes had opened 3 weeks after the Black Hawk landed. He looked at Megan and whispered, "Valkyrie." She'd adjusted his fall with hands steady as surgical lasers and said, "Just your nurse, Colonel." He'd cried then, understanding finally that the woman who'd pulled him from an ambush he wasn't supposed to survive had spent years carrying the weight of that survival alone. On Veterans Day, 2 years and 4 months after Sterling was escorted out in handcuffs, Oak Creek Memorial held a ceremony at the O'Brien Trauma Wing. Megan stood at the microphone while her son sat in the front row, finally understanding who his mother really was. She didn't give a speech so much as offer a quiet truth. People ask what makes a warrior. They think it's weapons or uniforms or rank. But I've learned this. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need only the courage to walk toward danger when everyone else runs away. The applause rose like a tide, and when it settled, Megan O'Brien was already walking back to the ICU, already checking monitors, already doing the invisible work that saves lives in rooms where no one's watching. So what would you have done in Megan's position? Would you have walked toward that armed man or run like everyone else? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this story is exactly why I'm asking, because every day, ordinary people do extraordinary things in places we never see. Subscribe to never miss what happens when the world finally discovers who they really are.